Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, when it comes to Canadian history, survey after survey suggests Canadians get a failing grade. Yes, Canadians can agree and point to shared values like fairness, peacekeeping, and social programs, but ask Canadians about past prime ministers and other key historical figures, and according to one study conducted by Ipsos 2 years ago, just 18% of Canadians would actually pass that test. So enter historian, educator, and author J.D.M. Stewart. His new book is called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. And in it, Stewart not only gives us an account of the 23 men and 1 woman who have held this country's top office, but also makes the argument, if we want to understand the country, it is imperative that we understand those who led it. Here now is J.D.M. Stewart and his new book, In Profile. J.D.M. Stewart, thank you for the time.
My pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to start here by quoting you to you, because in this book you write, if we want to understand the country, it is imperative that we understand those who led it. Build on that argument for us, because I do wonder how understanding prime ministers of the past, in your mind, helps us understand the Canada of today.
Well, I think that's sort of the basic premise of understanding your history is if you want to understand your country, you need to know what's happened before it. And I like to quote Peter C. Newman, the former great journalist in Canada, who said, "An hour in the office of Prime Minister is an hour in the history of the country." And I think we have to look at the decisions that were made over the course of the 150 plus years of Canada. Why were the decisions made? Who were the people that made the decisions? What were the consequences? And by looking at Canadian history through the lens of our leaders, the prime ministers, we're definitely going to learn something about the country and why we are who we are today.
Okay, but the men and the 1 woman who has held the office of Prime Minister, they are necessarily influenced and educated by their times, and therefore what they did, what they did not do is limited by their time in history. And when you look at issues like Indigenous rights, LGBTQ rights, women's issues, multiculturalism, how does that factor in? Again, limited by their time, trying to apply that to today.
Well, this is a way that you can understand the country. So if you look at some of the topics that you cited, whether it's Indigenous issues, LGBTQ rights, prime ministers have had to deal with those issues. Anyway, going all the way back to Sir John A. Macdonald on the Indigenous file, the LGBTQ issues, if you wanted to dig into John Diefenbaker, for example, who on the one hand was bringing forward the Bill of Rights in 1960-61, and on the other hand was turning a blind eye to much of the prejudice that was happening to the civil service, people who were deemed to be homosexual or, I guess, different terms that they used in those days. Diefenbaker was turning a blind eye to that. So when you dig into history and you look at the people who made changes, you're going to find out about the nature of the country and see why did people make decisions? Why didn't they make decisions? What was the context of the time for Diefenbaker not to act? Why was Macdonald the way he was? What about Pierre Trudeau and his issues that he dealt with in terms of Indigenous people and his white paper where he wanted to get rid of the Indian Act altogether? So there's always something to be learned when you study history. There's always something to be learned when you look at the people who made the decisions that they did. And that opens up conversations and a discovery to what your country is all about.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Macdonald, and of course, Sir John A. Macdonald has been a subject of controversy in recent years. I'm wondering what you make of that debate, because in many instances, we saw calls across the country to have his statue torn down because of the role he played in founding a system that led to residential schools.
Yeah, I think the debates around Macdonald reveal a couple of things. One of them is the dynamic nature of history and the fact that history is often a battlefield where people are bringing their own present day concerns and sometimes using history to try to fight a battle for today. But also to me, it speaks to the fact that we need to know our history really well, because some of the information about John A. Macdonald was misinformation. I don't think people really understood the whole Macdonald era in terms of the bad things he did with Indigenous people, but also some of the issues that For example, he brought forward a bill in 1885 called the Franchise Bill to try to give Indigenous people the right to vote, and women the right to vote at the same time too. But it does, Michael, also expose the idea that history changes, and we have to think about the context of the times. So what was happening in McDonald's Canada, we didn't have the same idea of what Canada is as we do today. So the arc of progress for Canada has generally been one towards justice and improved rights for everybody, but it certainly didn't start out that way. And so it's important for us to understand that 19th century Canada is not 21st century Canada. And when you read about prime ministers or you read about other aspects of history, you'll see that they were different times. And I think that's a really important lesson to understand in history, is that it's not the same. And different times are, there's different circumstances, and we need to understand them in order to really understand why something happened.
Mm-hmm. And when you, for example, bring up the right to vote, MacDonald, if I'm remembering your book correctly here, he also acknowledged the fact that Canada as a land was occupied by Indigenous peoples long before the British and the French, which struck me as something that was left out of the debate a few years ago.
Well, I think, what happens in these kinds of debates is people will bring forward what their concerns are today. And people are rightly concerned about the plight of Indigenous people over the history of Canada. But we have to use a historical lens instead of a present day lens. And people would try to portray Sir John A. Macdonald as some kind of a monster, but he wasn't that kind of a person. Surely we would do things differently today, and that's to be expected. But Macdonald was not the menacing figure, I think, that some people would have us believe today. And to me, that's just another lesson to try to know your history a little bit better and to look at it with nuance and understanding that different periods of time reflect different aspects of what Canadians are thinking and doing. And it's a different time. And there was a historian, I think it was Mr. Little, who said that the past is a completely foreign country to us. And it kind of is, because it happened a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to build a little bit on the argument that you're making here and try to apply it to today, because when we talk about Sir John A., yes, the Indigenous issue has come up in the last few years, but also now coming up in the last year is the United States reviving Manifest Destiny. And when you think of Sir John A. Macdonald and Manifest Destiny as expressed by the Monroe Doctrine around or just before Macdonald's time, how does Macdonald's reaction to Manifest Destiny back then inform the decisions that are being made now, do you think?
I think what it shows us is that the issue of being a country right on the border with the United States has been something that has been a concern for every prime minister, from John A. Macdonald to Mark Carney. The history there shows you that Macdonald was looking to create a backstop so that we wouldn't be absorbed by the United States. And so it also shows us that things aren't new. And every prime minister of Canada has had to deal with the problem of the United States. Sometimes a great neighbor and ally to us, other times more menacing. During the Laurier years, for example, Wilfrid Laurier had to deal with President Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "I'm going to be ugly." And this was over the 1903 Alaska boundary dispute, where Roosevelt threatened to send troops up into Alaska and take the panhandle. In the end, the issue was settled. But going back to Macdonald's time in Manifest Destiny and tracing it through every prime minister, we see that the United States has always been a challenge for Canada to deal with. And I remember one quote from the CBC television series Canada People's History, and the narrator says, for Canada, geography is destiny. And when you're situated between two superpowers, like Russia on the other side of the Arctic from us and the United States on our southern border, that puts a particular kind of pressure on you. And it's been really like that since before Canada was even born as a country in 1867.
Mm-hmm. And how we navigate the pressure certainly has informed our history as a country. I'm wondering, when you think about the current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is there a Prime Minister from whom he can learn lessons to tackle not only the challenge of the United States, but out of that, the economic challenge that Canada now faces?
Yeah, I think every prime minister would have some kind of lesson to impart to the current prime minister. But one of the most important ones, I think, is one that I would pull from the playbook of William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was prime minister during the Second World War, also prime minister for a few years during the 1920s. But Mackenzie King was famous for his pragmatism. And many prime ministers have picked up on that theme, both before and after him, but King was probably the most famous for being pragmatic. And I think you see the current prime minister, Mark Carney, using some of this pragmatism philosophy in the way that he's been dealing with the United States and other allies around the world. It's a tough time to be prime minister right now. Even in the best of times, governing Canada is a challenge. But pragmatism and, there was a famous poem about Mackenzie King by F.R. Scott, and one of the final lines in it is something like, "Do nothing by halves, which can be done by quarters." So pragmatism is really important. And another thing Mackenzie King said was, sometimes the success of my prime ministership should be measured by the things that didn't happen, that I didn't do, as opposed to the things that I did do. So sometimes it is preventing bad things from happening that is really important for a prime minister. And you can see Mark Carney really trying to thread that needle as he deals with a very difficult global political time right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm surprised that you chose Mackenzie King, because I thought you might choose Louis St. Laurent, because of course Mark Carney references the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway when he talks about major projects, and that of course fell under Louis St. Laurent's time. Are there lessons to be learned from that prime minister for the current prime minister?
Sure, there are a number of similarities between Mark Carney and Louis St. Laurent. And certainly the big projects that St. Laurent took on, not just the St. Lawrence Seaway, but also the Trans-Canada Highway, Arctic security with the distant early warning line, and just a more robust foreign policy emerged under the time of Louis St. Laurent. But he was also a very diligent and serious man about his job. He was always the best briefed person in the cabinet room. And you can see that Mark Carney brings that CEO kind of disposition to the job, and St. Laurent brought the CEO disposition to the job. They sometimes referred to him as the chairman of the board. So Louis St. Laurent has a great lesson for many of our prime ministers, and I suspect Mark Carney has probably been reading up on Louis St. Laurent a little bit, at least in terms of the great projects file.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You referenced prime ministers as a whole, and I do want to talk about less Mark Carney, but more the traits of prime ministers in general. Well, what do you think is a common trait? Because this is a rare honor. We've only had 24 prime ministers throughout the history of this country. Is there a trait that you can point to that all prime ministers shared?
I would go back to this pragmatism argument, and I think all prime ministers have had that because of the difficulty of governing a country that is as wide as we are, with different ethnicities, linguistic groups. We've got a sizable francophone population in the country, and so prime ministers have to have that pragmatism and be willing to put some water in their wine sometimes. I don't think Mark Carney got everything he wanted when he signed his MOU with the province of Alberta. Both sides had to put some water in their wine. And the other thing is capacity for hard work. A lot of Canadians may or may not realize, but the Prime Minister of Canada works really hard at his job, and it's very demanding and takes a lot of physical stamina. The travel is quite something. The hours are long, and so that's another bit of a characteristic that I think most prime ministers have had.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that you are an educator of history, but I'm going to lean a little bit on my literature days and ask you about Shakespearean flaw, because if pragmatism is a strength that every prime minister has brought, is there a trait that has plagued every prime minister as perhaps a weakness rather than a strength?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is probably hubris or ego. Prime ministers tend not to know when it's time to leave. And if you look at the previous prime minister, Justin Trudeau, I think it seems obvious that the writing was on the wall, that it was time for him to go in terms of the way Canadians were feeling about him, but he really had to be pushed hard to get out of there. Similarly with Stephen Harper, at the end of his time in office, the electorate decided to vote out the Conservatives. And so prime ministers they often believe in their own indispensability. And I think that comes with the length of time you're in office. And often you're surrounded by people who think you are indispensable. Very few people will speak truth to power. And I think it's something prime ministers would benefit from if they did have one or two people who would speak truth to power to them, so that they might get out of office before someone boots them out of office.
That leads me to another issue I had in mind, though, because I wonder about prime ministers. When you go through all this research, I wonder about their exercise in power, because some prime ministers have ruled through cabinet. And so we have times when cabinet and cabinet ministers had a very powerful influence on what government did, how government proceeded. And more recently, we've seen the prime minister's office being central to all these ministries, and perhaps less of a focus on cabinet. How has that evolved over time? Is that to the detriment or to the benefit of this country, do you think?
I think it's a really good question, because cabinet government is very important in our system. And I was just reading a book recently by Patrice Dutil. It was edited by Professor Patrice Dutil from Toronto Metropolitan University, and it was a series of essays about Mackenzie King. And one of the essays talked about the strength of his cabinet. He had a very strong wartime cabinet, people who were skilled at their portfolios and had leadership qualities. And then, obviously, since that time, we've kind of shrunk that power base to a very small number of people. And I think we would benefit from cabinet government where cabinet ministers have more ability to do their job, where the prime minister gives them more rope to do it, and it would take a little bit of pressure off even the prime minister himself. To some degree, the last prime minister actually to do that was Jean Chrétien. He was very good at giving his ministers room to maneuver. He would meet with them when they needed a meeting. And one of the theories behind the idea of why was Mr. Chrétien like that was that he grew up in the government under Lester B. Pearson. Pearson, obviously, 1960s, it's cabinet government as well. So he had that foothold in the previous style of governing. But really, since the days of Pierre Trudeau, that center really started to tighten up. And I don't think it's to the benefit of the government or Canadians, and that I don't know if it's going to change back, because once you get a hold of power, most people don't really like to relinquish it.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how short-sighted that is, though, too, because you mentioned Pearson, and I look through this book, and I know there's one photograph in this book that has Pearson with Trudeau, the elder, Pierre. We have him with Chrétien, as well as John Turner, the three men who would, in time, succeed Pearson in the Prime Minister's chair. How short-sighted is it not to lean on cabinet more?
I think it is short-sighted. And one of the things I've been toying with in my head is why aren't we having a really strong cabinet like we used to in the old days? And I'm wondering if perhaps we're not getting the same types of people that are running for public office. And so you don't have the same timber to draw from. And I feel that there is less of an emphasis on public service in the country, because it is a sacrifice to go into public service. But a lot of people used to be willing to make that sacrifice, but now it's become probably a bit too sharp and pointy to be in politics with the way things are on social media. And so maybe we're getting people less interested to serve in public office as a result. So it all kind of spirals in and gives us a weaker set of people to draw from, weaker government, fewer people doing more things. And I don't think that leads to the best thing in decision making and in the best outcome. So I don't know if it's going to change back, Michael, but it would be great if we could draw on some of our best leaders from business and the arts, athletics, whatever it may be, and get those people into cabinet and really feeling like we had a strong team of people to look up to and lead us.
Mm-hmm. The best people, as you say, regardless who that person is. And as I say that, we can't ignore the fact that, yes, 24 people have held the office of Prime Minister, but only one woman has successfully done so, Kim Campbell. Why do you think it has only been one female Prime Minister?
It's another good question. And sometimes the really good questions don't always have answers. And I'm not sure what the answer is. But I will say that when I was interviewing Kim Campbell for my first book. And I was about to wrap up the conversation with her, being respectful of her time. And then she led me to believe that she wanted to keep talking, which she did. And she wanted to talk about the fact that, when she was running for prime minister, she felt that she'd done some research in it. And she said, the paradigm in 1993, it just wasn't really there. People weren't used to the idea of having a Canadian woman as prime minister, and the electorate maybe just wasn't ready to take that plunge. But that was 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, and we've had no one come close to being our second female prime minister. And I don't know, I think that there are a lot of systemic obstacles to women going into politics, and that's probably a topic for another one of your episodes. But we know that they're there, and people like Catherine McKenna has written about them in her recent memoir. But it's problematic. I would like to see, obviously, a second Canadian woman become prime minister. I don't know when it's going to happen. There doesn't appear to be a woman pushing at the door right now to be that person. And so I'm just a bit flummoxed. And sometimes you just have to say, I don't know the answer.
Oh, that is absolutely fair to say. Thank you for being so frank. Listen, I wonder in the researching of this book, if anything that you came across actually surprised you.
I guess, one of the things that surprised me was, I should preface it by saying, I wasn't totally surprised by this, because I knew I wanted to put the Indigenous lens on my chapters, and I was pleasantly surprised that it was all there in plain sight, that there was quite a bit of traffic coming through the Office of Prime Minister that related to Indigenous files. So I was surprised at just how available that information was, and I'm glad that it came forward to Canadians in this book. Similarly with the environment, you might have thought that the environmental policies were something that just came around in the 1960s, but environmental leadership by prime ministers actually goes back to Sir John A. Macdonald, who created the first national park in Banff. The other thing that I found interesting was, and this hasn't been picked up on in any of my interviews so far about the book, is that there's quite a bit of cultural resonance from Canadian prime ministers. And by that, I mean, there have been television miniseries made about prime ministers, one about Laurier, one about Mackenzie King. And then 2 years after Pierre Trudeau died, there was a CBC miniseries about him. So the cultural aspect of prime ministers is there. There have been plays written. There have been musicals. There's been poetry written about prime ministers. The most famous one was the one I mentioned earlier by F.R. Scott. So prime ministers have made a cultural imprint in our Canadian society as well, and that's never been really looked at in too much detail. Even people might remember the famous quilt. I can't remember the name of the artist, but it was Reason Over Passion, and it was a quilt that the artist made in homage to Pierre Trudeau. So that, I think, was another one of the surprises, is just the amount of cultural imprint that the history of our prime ministers have made.
Mm-hmm. You talked about it a bit off top, and in the last couple of minutes that we have left in this conversation, I do want to pick up on this idea of learning our history and knowing it better, because survey after survey shows us that Canadians might be able to point to common values, but don't really know our history very well. Why is that?
Well, you're getting to a topic that's very close to my heart, Michael. As you know, I taught history for 30 years. And it was the reason why I became a teacher, was to teach Canadian history. And there's only 4 provinces in Canada that require Canadian history as a required course in high school. I think that's a big problem. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. And, in the introduction, I say that I was speaking to a group of high school students at a model United Nations, and I had a picture of Lester B. Pearson on my screen, and it even said his name, Lester B. Pearson. I said to the students, "Who is this man?" And nobody knew who Lester B. Pearson was. Yet here he was, a Nobel Prize winner, 1956, and our Canadian Prime Minister from 1963 to 1968, and who did quite a number of important things in Canadian history. So I'm alarmed by that. I have spent my adult life trying to address the issues of the lack of understanding of Canadians on their history. It's one of the reasons why I wrote this book and think it probably should be in every Canadian high school library, because to know your past is to know who you are today. And there's many different entry points into Canadian history. This one happens to be through the lens of prime ministers, and that's where a lot of important decisions are made. But there are other ways to get into Canadian history, not just through prime ministers, and I think it's really important that more of us read and think about who we are and how we came to be. And it may even be more particularly important, given that there are threats to Canadian sovereignty coming from, particularly from the United States. And if you know who you are as a country, you can stand up to those things a bit more resolutely.
Well, perhaps you'll be happy to know that it was two history teachers that changed the course of my life, led me to political journalism, grade 11, grade 12 history teachers, Halton Doyle and John Zeman. And if people want to get into the history, of course, there is this book. J.D.M. Stewart, thank you for the Prime Ministers.
My pleasure. Glad to hear about the teachers.
Take care. Historian, educator, and author J.D.M. Stewart. The book is called The Prime Ministers. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again on the next profile.